Okay. Okay. So my name is Najjuko Joanita, and I am part of the Nawi collective. And Nawi is a Pan-African feminist collective working at the intersections of economic justice and feminist political economy. A lot of our work is concerned with how economies are organized, whose labor is recognized or whose labor is erased, and what it would mean to build systems that sustain life. And over the past few years, we have been doing work around digital economies and the future of work. And in this work portfolio, we have been looking at how digitalization is reshaping labor across the continent. And particularly, we've been interested in what these shifts and these changes reveal about power, about capitalism, about gender dynamics, and really about the conditions that people are expected to work and survive. So, this series is part of our Labour Month campaign where we are hoping to collectively think through the current moment. We are asking what is happening to labor in a world shaped by increasing authoritarianism, war, shrinking civic space, increasing concentration of corporate power, and what this really means for feminist organizing, for workers, and how we imagine just and livable futures. And for today's session, we have our opening keynote, which is meant to help locate ourselves politically. So before we get in depth into the other conversations, this keynote will really help us understand the current state of power and what it means for labor and all of us as workers. After the keynote, I will open the floor for some questions, comments, thoughts, and reflections from the audience. But you can also use the chat and raise your hand after the session so that you can engage in the discussion. And sorry, it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, who will be Rosebell Kagumire. Rosebell is a comrade in every sense of the word. We organize together in the feminist movement in Uganda, and I have had the honor of becoming her friend by proxy. Rosebell is the kind of person who never says no to a fight. And I have come to appreciate the ways in which you move through the world, Rosebell, and how you constantly fight against injustice, but also how you keep showing up for the feminist futures we are trying to build. So before I say a little more about the session, I'd like to invite Rosebell to introduce herself and tell us a bit more on what she has been up to lately. Over to you,
Thanks.
Rosebell.
Thanks so much, Joanita. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to join Nawi and everybody in this collective thinking and reflection on where we are, we've come from, and where we wish to go or where we are headed. Yes, I'm Ugandan writer, communications specialist. I'm also currently a student doing my PhD in digital media at the University of Porto in Portugal. And this brings together really long life commitment to have almost become like part and parcel of the digital for me, having existed from the start of how digital networks were evolving to today, and seeing that it's been such an honor to connect with very many people via all these platforms and networks. And kind of studying this gives me a bit of grounding in a time of crisis. I've also been recently joined a couple of comrades to write on the continuities and past between African liberation and Palestine resistance movement. And I've been currently in the last few months doing a lot of work around that, and where the African feminist fight locates this greater push for freedom in this current moment. So that's really a little bit of what I do. I also have a platform called African Feminism, where we've been documenting African feminist struggles for the last 10 years. And we are a really good repository to see what is happening in different parts. We don't cover everywhere, but we do our best to work with different African comrades to tell stories and give analysis and give our voice on what is happening around us. So yeah, so that is a very bit of everything I do. And lastly, I also do my feminism with a collective called African Feminist Collective on Feminist Informed Policies. So it's kind of a framework that we are engaging in and pushing back and making sure that the framework really serves our decolonial push as feminists on the continent. That's what I can talk about, and I'm pleased to join you today.
Thank you, Rosebell, for that. And to frame today's keynote briefly, the session is titled The State of Power, Labor in an Age of Crisis. And we invited Rosebell to help us think through the current organization of power and what it means for labor across the continent and beyond. We are interested in understanding work within the wider political economy of crisis. Like the ones I mentioned before, we are seeing a rise of authoritarian and repressive forms of governance, war, militarism, anti-rights, deepening financialisation, and all the other forces that are currently shaping the conditions under which we live. But at the same time, we are also thinking around the growing power of multinational tech corporations, the role of big tech, data economies, and digital infrastructures in the way that they are shaping labor. And we are interested not only in how tech is changing work, but in the ways in which power is being reorganized through these systems. So, with that, I will hand us over to the very capable hands of Rosebell, who will share her brilliance with us.
It is our brilliance. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that it's important, like you said, to situate this moment in this work in anything we are trying to do in the realities of the moment. The fact that many of us are living in either okay, Martha, okay, yeah. Many of us are living in countries that are quite facing a massive challenges from stability, conflict, debt crisis, you know, all kinds of pushes, power and dictatorships, and the push by global powers and middle powers to really scramble for whatever is left of our continent's resources. And we are kind of caught up somewhere in the middle of all this fight, having also survived a pandemic and lost so many people, and also lost so many livelihoods to the pandemic. So it's very important to reflect on where this moment finds us, with millions of people across Africa displaced from their countries, from Sudan to Congo to Sahel, Ethiopia to Somalia, and many other displacements due to conflict, climate change, that both that we see every day and those that are evolving. It's very important to know that we are at a moment of great strife, and if you're not facing one or the other, there's always something pressing, really, like you're not entirely sure. The level of uncertainty is really high, and higher than we have probably seen in the last 30 years for many countries. This also has shown us kind of crystallization of power, those who have power, when crisis knocks on that door, it both exposes those who are, okay, cool. It exposes both the struggle for power that is ongoing, but also for those that have power crystallizing that power and failing to be accountable to the citizens. So that's where we see the civic space being narrowed down, media being repressed, and the work of organizing becoming very precarious. Both online spaces and offline spaces as not being separate but extensions of our realities. So we need to recognize that in the kind of losses we are seeing every day through genocide and loss that we might not take a moment to to, to deeply reflect on, but actually informs our embeds in our psyche and in our community. That in many ways, when we are trying um, to hustle every day and to make a living, that we might not have even enough time to reflect on that on loss and what we are losing as a result of the struggle. So I wanted to reflect on that and for us to know that this conversation is truly within that moment, that the labor is happening, the labor we are talking about is happening within a context of really loss and contestations and struggle. Um, that said, I think I want to reflect on a couple of works that African feminists or Africans have worked on labor. From example, in the works from northern Ghana, I was looking at artisanal gold miners, and oftentimes artisanal miners are portrayed as simply poor people scraping for a living. But I found that in oftentimes the women who were doing this work of mining, they claimed to be miners. They said in one of the pieces of work, they said we are miners to reclaim that they choose that work also. That they choose that work. So if we don't see them as not be, if we see them as not belonging, then we can't make their work, the workplaces and the realities better. It's a reminder that the state may not recognize them as workers. They might not even count their labor. We might not see their labor in national data and statistics, and often rendered invisible within global supply chains that are against them. But in one of these work where the women declare we are mine workers, it is an assertion also for them to claim their work and their identity, because often work also shapes our social identity and our social existence, social economic existence. So it's very important to remember that people claiming their work and not simply seeing people as one lens of poverty. Um, so as we reflect between our past and the present, is today is we join together to reflect on our present and our past to imagine how can we construct feminist labor futures in this age of crisis. I've already talked about how we are looking at we are living in a polycrisis already with wars, pandemics, financial shocks that we are trying to come out of, and we're also really facing major ecological degradation as we drift into authoritarianism. So this is within which we look at our labor, and our labor today is also impacted by austerity and kind of what we see both the pandemic and austerity and other pressures have largely produced what we can see as a patriarchal reset, where people are, even when we are on digital platforms and we are trying to work, we see a major re-domesticating of women's labor and also weakening of public services. So without major education reforms, without health reforms, our work is really pretty precarious, because even what we earn then goes to all these services out of our pockets, which should be public services. So it's very important to think of that in as well as reflect on how the ecological crisis we see is connected to the capitalist power in the rush for resources, and Africa being the epicenter of this rush. Yes. Also, I situate this crisis not as an exception to capitalist social reproduction, but its very current form. It's at the core of capitalist social reproduction. So we are not necessarily our crisis across Congo, Gaza, Sahel, and all these places. It's not an exception. It's really the crisis that is at the heart of capitalism and what it produces. So amidst of this, it's very important to recognize that therefore the state in many countries, the state is trying to figure out what to do with what they term as surplus populations. So and nowhere else is this quite clear when we see the feminization of foreign labor exports and what the state in Africa might see as a surplus population. And that surplus population is very gendered. Its class is gendered. It's a certain category of people being excluded from the very infrastructure of their country and being modeled to fit a certain purpose within the economy that we don't see as having power over those economies. So it's within these conditions that we have seen the growth of digital capitalism. Beyond the capitalism happening elsewhere, also the digital capitalism fits within this. And when we look at the digital capitalism, we are speaking directly about how private capital continues to grow beyond, in many cases, beyond the state and citizen oversight. This has enabled also new forms of extraction and new forms of repression. So the extraction is at the heart of digital infrastructure and the growth. So when people are really praising the large scale innovation and large scale of what is termed as development, as what is promised to get out of the deprivation that we've suffered for generations since colonization, what is hidden is the power of private capital and how our countries are not even sometimes in position to have oversight on that. So this extraction has real repercussions, and the repercussions are also reflected in the precarity of work, both digital and non-digital work. So, but we also know that in history has demonstrated that workers have always responded to this kind of fortified capital. So therefore, it's very important to reflect on feminist resistance and how it can shape and reshape labor organizing, both in Africa and globally. So therefore, that's why we are here with a promise of an African feminist political economic lens and practice, and what pathways it can offer us to out of this crisis, both during and out of this crisis. So I also want to reflect deeper on what digital capitalism and platform power looks like. Platform power now represents that kind of concentration of capital that when we talk about big tech, all these massive corporations that run services that run our lives from what we are able to buy, what we are able to access in a market, the kind of public service we are able to seek and what we see. So we are seeing markets running almost entirely with private ownership and regulation at own will. So when you have all these corporations that there is not something in place to actually regulate them, it becomes like the shift in economic power happens in real time into the hands of few dominant players. So platforms might be portrayed as businesses, as someone being brilliant in Silicon Valley and coming up with an innovative idea. But we have woken up to the fact that these are not businesses. These are techno-political players. They constitute markets, they set the rules, and they define both work and the worker. So in this case, we see governance functions that once were subject to public deliberations, where parliaments or other constitutive bodies could look through how a company was functioning and the kind of safeguards in place. We see these platform infrastructure now fully privatized, but out of the reach of that oversight. And with that, we get into the logics of what we see as surveillance capitalism. This is where you see the conversion of human experience into behavior data and asset values. So we are on platforms, we are trying to do our best to get our work done there. But in the process, we are feeding data to these farms, to these corporations. And that data is a value is attached to the data. So in terms of we see the economic merges with the political, producing what is unprecedented levels of political capitalism. So the state and the corporation in many places is slowly fusing. So while in some countries the state might be still far removed from that capital to the digital capital to reign in it, we see that in big kind of economic powers, we see that the state and the corporates are fusing, and then that fusion of power has repercussions for countries like ours. In terms of how digital empires are coming to us, reinforce that kind of authoritarianism in terms of what we see today in America, trying to access health data from African countries. We've seen all these deals that have been, opaque, put before countries like Ghana, Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, and the others that are being arm twisted into these data deals. This is not simply about our health, it's also about the kind of value that data is and who's going to be able to determine how this data is used, but extract the data for continuous innovative advances that only benefit those that own our data. So it's very important to know that also within that, then we see how surrounding innovation and technology remain tools of conquest and control, as we see in the increased American deals. But America is not alone in these kind of deals. We also know that we have seen China supplying a lot of data tools, driven tools for surveillance, for kind of enabling state infrastructure to be able to control the people. So we know that not only those, but also like middle powers and all what is going on. So the technologies are not only about the privatization and affecting our labor, but when there is repression, what does labor look like in a repressive conditions? I wanted us to look at that and reflect much on that infrastructure that is being moved around under our feet, with our governments almost struggling to negotiate, to not only negotiate but protect us from the onslaught of this data colonialism that is advancing. So then I think that our work is situated within what we might look at as a digital decolonial turn, looking at the platforms as really platform capitalism and trying to understand what it does to African, Asian, Latin American, and West Asian, and other formerly colonized countries that will not have power on that table where decisions are being made, and how this is not a replacement of old labor relations, but really we know that it is a continuation, that desertification is also about accumulation by possession. So we need to see that and apply our decolonizing lens into the digital definitions of labor and how labor is being impacted, with gig economies increasing and looking at the extraction that is at the heart of those gig economies from an average worker in the global south. I will jump a bit to think about how we see across the continent the governments are responding and what we can do in that response. But we also know that the political economy of knowledge is of regulation is also captured. So we need to engage in how our governments are responding to these power pushes from different platforms and also governments, because we see the major platforms with their governments, just as we saw in colonization. We know the capital, the companies, sometimes they arrive before even their government, and they depend on each other um, to impact our work, to impact our lives. So we see the fusion, the openly fusion of political power and economic power from those countries. And sometimes the political is the extension of the economic, and the economic is the extension of the political. So we need to look at we need to be able to look at this through a decolonizing work. Um, then I will lastly talk about how the kind of impact on the work then these kind of um, big digital platforms and what they are having on the work, fragmentation of our work, and we see like a lot of opaque kind of deals happening, and then the repression is not just your government. So the repression is also out to discipline the worker. The fact that it's not difficult, it's not easy anymore to hold a protest, have a strike. So a strike becomes extremely political now, and for most of African women, the wage relation has rarely been central. So we look at ideas of like classes of working women that circulate between, you know, the factory. So the work is not, the fragmentation of work is no longer like I work in this one place. So in a given day, one person transcends different kind of work. One person works in a factory, and another in the market, and another at the end of the day you're doing care and informal work. So it's very important to see how that fragmentation of work is also still happening. Like you're not doing just one work. So then where are you a worker? It becomes difficult to define and organize in that case. While people are, it is also because people are struggling to keep up with the demands of of the current economies. So that fragmentation is happening. But also the fragmentation means that you invisibilize workers. When workers are spread thin across so many different, it's the same worker but spread thin across different sectors, for both digital and non-digital. So we also know that what we look at self-exploitation. So basically, platforms mobilize workers' desires through gamification, entrepreneurship, fantasy. I think we've all read all these great reports about how Africa has the highest female entrepreneurs in the world. um, so we are slowly making this entrepreneurship as a fantasy, as a place, the hyper meritocratic ideology, uh, the woman that is making it work despite of everything. And that in itself is not the entire story. So the idea is to make us complicit in our own exhaustion. So if you're seen to be doing okay despite everything that's happening to you, then we know that the solutions will not be addressed to you. It'll be like you're still okay, so we'll look for the people that don't look okay. So we need to be self-aware of that kind of exploitation, that self-exploitation, that this kind of narratives feed into, that gave us the false idea of merit and meritocracy ideology that we are doing okay as workers, as women, as non-binary people, as gender expansive people in working in this time. Then we also, I already talked a little bit about the criminalization of work. So when the state and the corporations come together, then you can no longer really easily demonstrate. You cannot, strike. Then you look like you're disrupting work, you're a public disturbance. So it's very important. We see definitions of like foreign interference becoming something that is increasingly defined to curtail any ideas of organizing, workers organizing. Yeah, and I think we know that African feminists have been doing a lot of work around this, whether it is around horticulture workers, industrial parks, around land policies, beyond what is visible usually. We have seen a lot of African feminist research going there towards bringing these parts of workspaces that are usually invisibilized, usually left as informal, to bring them to the center of our movement, our movements and organizing. And that's where the work is, to look at the margins within the margins and focusing on that work and bringing our solidarities. And lastly, the solidarity I wanted to speak about is on how worker organizing is happening in the feminist resistance, how these are new solidarities. Uh, we might as well, in the last few months, read anywhere every day to see a protest, a workers' protest, a strike over here. These are not things we should take lightly. These are very important power contestations that are happening. In recent years, we've seen tech workers, from engineers, product managers, content moderators, warehouse workers, hail drivers, from Uber to Bolt and others. We have seen them slowly organizing to really across different classes. So across the chain of a platform, we have seen the need to organize across those classes. So it's not enough that you're just an engineer. We need to be, if you're an engineer in the platform, you're also concerned about what the warehouse worker is doing, what the driver at the end of the day is doing. So this kind of increasing unlikely organizers is very important, and it's going to be the future, because we have to look beyond the class. The life cycle of that platform and what keeps it functioning. If we don't disrupt those processes, if people working at the different chains of this platform and its services do not come together, then it's not easy for a movement to only be the movement of only content creators or content moderators, for example. So we need to see a lot of activism that is durable, that is going to look at worker resistance across class. That is very, very important. And we also have seen, of course, these examples we have seen in Kenya, where content moderators formed unions. We have seen ride-hailing apps drivers striking in Kenya, South Africa, in Nigeria. And also, we have seen domestic workers use platforms like Sweep South in South Africa, where they are hacking platform capitalism in a way that they are navigating, circumventing that app to keep themselves or continue to work. We know about the mine workers I've talked about in Ghana. There's also enough research, for example, about gig workers in Egypt, how they navigate the platforms that are trying to extract from them. So it's already, all this work is already done through a feminist lens, analysis, and all this. It's very important to continue to learn from this. Lastly, I think it's very important to reflect on what we can call alternative solidarities, and I think these are advanced by very key feminist voices like Joyce Banks. So where we see a community as a site of production, it remains very vital. So we need to increasingly make communities communities across borders, communities of workers across the different strata of what a platform gives. So it's very, very important to look at that, to name the community as a site of production, and vice versa, and make a site of production a community, so that you're able to organize together and come to be able to push back against this kind of platforms that we are seeing. I think that there's a lot to cover on this topic, but for me, it's that, to reflect on what feminists are doing, both theorizing, but also what kind of inroads can we make in our organizing, and not remain at an elite level, not remain organizing only because historically we have done feminist work in social matters, on human rights, on conflict, which are very, very important. But without understanding that even in the middle of the conflict, there is a gig worker. Even in a humanitarian situation, there's an African worker whom the platform is exploiting. Understanding that these are not happening either in the city only, and or in a given locality where there's a gold mine, to seek these kind of cross-cutting issues when it comes to work, that we are also workers in this moment, from horticulture workers to industrial parks and all these manufacturing, that we are being positioned as the place to manufacture things for the world. So we have a lot of work at our hands, and but for me, what we need to look into is how workers are already mobilizing, and what can our feminist mobilization, our feminist theory and practice can bring into this moment as workers, continue to push back on these challenges, and remembering that that important thing, that a community is always a site of production. So it's not only happening on the platforms, but within our communities, and seek those and make sure that we bring together the work that African feminists in the political economy are already doing, in order to challenge the kind of infrastructure of fragmentation, surveillance, and criminalization, so that we're able to fully show up for different workers, even for ourselves, because we're all we are workers. So that's what I wanted to reflect on. We can always bring the rest in. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosebell, for that generous keynote and generous reflections. I think a lot has stood out for me, but especially how sometimes when we talk about labor, we can think of it in a very narrow sense in terms of, employment. But you've talked about miners, you've talked about workers in horticulture, you've talked about different forms of work. And so it's not always only about jobs, around wages. You've talked about community as a site of production. So it's important to always think about labor in terms of power as well, in terms of who controls time, who controls the resources, who is able to get protections, and who is made visible, right? And I think I've also really appreciated how you've been able to articulate the digital infrastructure and the way the digital economies are happening within a much longer history of our continent. And you talked about how the companies come before the governments come, of which right now we see an enmeshment, and you can't really separate who is who. But I'll share a few reflections and some few questions that you can answer now or after some of the questions from the audience. But I think when you're talking about solidarity among workers, one of the conversations I've had recently is around doctors and someone asking why it is that we don't see doctors, on the streets. We usually see like nurses, we see, like interns, but sometimes it's very unlikely, at least in contexts like ours, to see doctors on the streets. So when you talked about unlikely organizing, that's where my mind went. And I think that a question I have that I'm not sure how you'll answer in terms of tech and state and not being able to separate is a question around sovereignty. And what let me see how I phrased it. So you talked about sovereignty, but you also talked about public services, and you also talked about foreign interference. And I think for me, the question is what all this means in terms of sovereignty for our continent, because we've seen a lot of conversations around sovereignty from our governments. If I can speak about Uganda, we have seen the protection of sovereignty bill, quote unquote, protecting us from foreign influence, but we know what that actually means. That it's a target on opposition, it's a target on activists, and all this still, is connected to digital economies, labor, and yeah, restricting resources. So, what do these conversations also mean in terms of sovereignty? Because you've talked about decolonial lens. So, how should we be thinking around this? I think the other question I had was also in terms of you talked about reclaiming identity and work and naming, but also I think in terms of language around future of work, as activists, as organizers, how can we maybe think around work beyond our worth, beyond it just being connected to our worth, and thinking beyond, productivity, if we are going to truly try to get liberation from capitalism in a way, right? Yeah, but those are things that you can think about, but I can also open the floor. I see Ghislaine has her hand up. And Ghislaine is going to speak in French. So if you need interpretation, please switch your channel to English. Ghislaine, over to you.
Ok, merci Joanita. Je remercie la Rosebell et je vais bondir pour proposer à ce webinaire une feuille de route parce que je suis en phase avec la présentation et puis aussi avec Joanita. Les concepts qui ont été utilisés, c'est les concepts de travailleurs. Et donc, cela veut dire que nous avons pris conscience qu'il est nécessaire de compter tout le monde qui travaille réellement et surtout les femmes comme des travailleuses qui ont droit à une protection et qui ont droit à un travail décent, qui ont droit à la justice sociale. Ça, c'est un premier élément qui est très important. Et pour vaincre les différents pouvoirs qui ont été énumérés par la présentatrice, nous avons réellement besoin d'une solidarité, pas une solidarité qui va être une solidarité euh, 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 discriminatoire, mais une solidarité au niveau international, régional et en tant qu'Africains et Africaines. Et là, cette opportunité existe aujourd'hui à travers donc la Confédération syndicale internationale qu'est la CSI Afrique, qui est une organisation réellement fédératrice, qui est une organisation africaine et qui aujourd'hui de plus en plus offre l'opportunité pour travailler avec tous les mouvements sociaux pour que nous puissions porter haut la voix des féministes, des femmes et tout ce qui est en lien donc avec les inégalités. Moi, je voudrais voir dans quelle mesure, au sortir de ce webinaire, nous pouvons saisir cette opportunité-là pour renforcer nos liens et travailler ensemble, surtout qu'aujourd'hui, dans quelques semaines, nous allons travailler sur la thématique des travailleurs et travailleuses des plateformes. Et en tant que féministe, en tant que responsable de l'égalité, je reste ouverte à ce que nous portons des lunettes genre féministes sur le travail des femmes qui sont au niveau des plateformes et que nous ayons vraiment notre caucus pour défendre cela Hein. Je suis contente que Nawi serait au niveau donc, de la conférence internationale du travail où tout cela se décide, où les voix sont autorisées à parler, que nous rejoignons nos voix pour qu'on ne noie pas les principaux problèmes féministes de la convention qui qui est en pleine discussion sur les plateformes. Ça, c'est aussi également quelque chose que je voudrais ajouter. Et enfin, lancer un appel pour dire il faudra que nous resserrons nos rangs, mouvements sociaux ou pas, mouvements de travailleurs. Nous sommes là en Ouganda. Il y a un comité des femmes du mouvement travailleur qui est là. Je crois qu'ils ont besoin de vous. Ce comité a besoin de vous pour que vous puissiez utiliser leur place dans le dialogue social pour porter haut tout ce qui est dit. Donc, je reste ouverte. Je mettrai mon adresse email. Nous couvrons 54 pays d'Afrique avec 111 organisations. Je crois quand même qu'on peut il y a quelque part quelque chose qu'on peut faire et il y a du pain sur la planche. Nous travaillerons donc ensemble et merci Joanita pour ces initiatives. I'm done. Thank you. So hope that everything is clear and I try to share what is important to us today. Yes, let's take the opportunity of ITUC Africa as an umbrella today who are opening her door to really promote feminist approach, Pan-Africanist feminist approach, and to really fight against all of these things who are blocking, making discrimination to promote women's rights, feminist approach in Africa. So let us work together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ghislaine. Always a pleasure to hear from you. And thank you for all the work you're doing with ITUC Africa and ensuring that women's voices and women's rights are recognized and visibilized, and that you don't tire. Sorry. You play. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, thank you so much, Ghislaine, for that reflection. And we are in touch. So I will follow up on some of the things that you have shared in terms of the, I think, the labor union for women in Uganda and some of the other proposals that you have shared. And for anyone who would like to connect with ITUC Africa or Ghislaine, she has shared her email address, but I've also shared the organization website that you can, that you can check out. Anyone else, if you'd like to speak, please put up your hand and I will. Okay, if you'd like, you can also put a question or comment in the chat. Maybe I can read Mika's comment, who has said that, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. They said, thank you, Rosebell. I'm particularly going to think on viewing and naming communities as sites of production. Yeah, that's true. Which links to work I have been doing in Canaland, that's in Western Cape, South Africa. I observed that the various communities, farm workers, production laborers, retail, and other services, and the overall local, including land, water, sunlight, excess labor, pool are not appreciated in the value chain when it comes to redistribution of the wealth of resources major corporations are extracting there. Thank you so much, Mika, for that. And Martha had also earlier shared that they totally resonate with fragmentation of care as a part-time platform worker and social worker, organizing and access to social protection becomes harder. Yeah. Thank you. Rosebell, maybe over to you as we see if there are any other reflections that come up.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, this is a very, very important reflection of our community, because we remember that I'm talking about decolonization. We've always made to think from the colonial times, a worker was not necessarily somebody in the community. You had to be working for the colonial government or working for the colonial organization, the East African, whatever company, all those companies that they made to come and exploit us and introduce cash crop economies. You needed to be in that in order to be looked at as a worker. So there was immediately the devaluing of African or other people's labor in that lens, in making those kind of strata in society of then who is a worker. So we have to remember that, and when we refocus back on communities and what kind of work is being there to sustain, but also I didn't touch a lot on social reproduction. You know, for many people, social reproduction, which is the amount of labor, you know. I had a part where we are looking at the labor of keeping each other alive. That is labor, you know, especially in this kind of crisis. The labor of feeding, the labor of, ensuring that community continues to reproduce life. That is labor, and it's invisibilized. And I had not really talked about that. And to really think of ways in which then that labor is not looked at as work. I look at the labor of who is feeding us, who's holding us together, who's organizing, who is teaching the children and the adults, who's doing the labor of remembering, you know, where we've come from. That is all labor, and it's rarely recognized even within labor movement. So where it put the work of women and gender expansive people is rarely reflected in labor movement. I remember as a journalist in Uganda going to attend all these organized responses about labor and strikes. It was always the men, you know. The labor MP was always a man, you know. From I don't know how much it has changed, and they seem to be perennial, like they never change face. You know, there was like that one man, you know, for 10, 15 years is the face of labor, but how much laboring was he doing now? And also when people switch like class, how does that impact on how labor they can represent the other laborers? We have to be very, I think that's what feminism helps us, you know, come to know that class changes dynamics. Are you still able to represent really truly the people who are still laboring in a different way? And that helps us kind of proof labor movements from capture, because somebody can easily switch to another kind of place and not totally represent the interest of the movement. So again, representation staying at the heart of the people who are doing that particular work is very important. And we are not perennially speaking on behalf of the disenfranchised, especially if we are not located in the. We can, but once you move that, I think you have to face the realities of that. You're not living that reality, even if you have lived that reality before. So therefore, continuously allow the people who are living a particular reality to represent themselves, even when you intimately know their hustle or their struggles. It's not enough, and that I think that is very important to make sure that we don't have the hijacking of people's organizing from the outside. The other part was on, yes, of course, we are looking at work which was already pushed on the margins. I talked about informal work, but I also wanted to remind us that sex work is work, and people who have always been criminalized, whose work has always been criminalized, even when they find some opportunities with the digitization and the platformization, is still intensely precarious. The same violence, you know, it is transported. sometimes it becomes worse because then you're dealing with a pool of people you can't even locate. We have seen like on when certain work that is already criminalized moves to the platforms, it's also the protections are not there because you're still criminalized within the laws, and the platforms don't feel the need to protect you. So we have to remember the work that we often also within our movements forget to center to learn from what is happening. So I would definitely like to know how platform work is happening within the sex worker movements and other movements that have been historically marginalized beyond like the rural urban divide that we are talking about also. Then also looking at the work of like Nawi, because thank you so much, because for a long time we were told that economies and all this work we are doing it was not reflecting the economy in the idea of GDP, right? So for a long time you're pushed on the side. It's like the work you're doing is not important, because if the state is not talking about this, then you're not important, and you continue to think you're not important even when you're struggling. So this work is also very important that now is doing, and really deconstructing and decolonizing our ideas about economies and who has value and who assigns value, and knowing that is inherently a power kind of struggle, and naming it, around identity, reclaiming identity and work, and naming again. It's like the example of sex work, when people don't want to recognize sex work as work, and sex worker unions have worked tremendously hard to say, this is our work, this is our identity, this is what I choose to do, and you need to respect that. So that's also an example of the naming and reclaiming in the midst of criminalization and silencing. Then the future of work around issues around what was it? Around technology, state, and sovereignty. Very, very difficult times. Give an example of, so for example, sometimes where, if you come from a repressive state, having a platform that was not governed can give you a slight room of thinking you have freedom, right? So as we saw, like with these platforms in Uganda, for example, when the government accounts were shut down by Meta, and in retaliation, the government shuts down Meta from Uganda, Facebook from Ugandans. So you see these kind of also contestations of power between the big platforms in the government, and where their behind the scenes interests do not meet necessarily. You see a clash, in that at the end of the day, people and workers, they suffer, in terms of how platforms can be taken away actually from you. We don't have the right to say you can't take this away. It can just be switched off, right? Because of that. And while in certain circumstances, then we used to think that, okay, the platform can give me a small inroad into claiming my labor and being paid for it. But the reality is that as long as we don't have a state infrastructure that works for us, that is accountable to us, then we are at the mercy of that infrastructure. I think that's where we are seeing. So the ideas of sovereignty are very important, but sovereign to what? If you are a state, you're also not accountable to your citizens. In this case, whose sovereignty matters, right? So these are not things that the states want to make it like black and white, but it's actually there are a lot of things happening in the gray zone that actually, as a state that is unaccountable, I don't understand what sovereignty means in this case. Sovereignty for the country, for example, in Uganda, Museveni and his family, that is the idea of sovereignty, not necessarily sovereignty for workers or sovereignty for me. They will willingly violate anyone's sovereignty. So the sovereignty seems to work when it is about the state and it wants to reclaim certain things, but without accountability. So also again, that puts us in. That's why we are in a very precarious state between kind of shrewd corporate power, capitalist global north and eastern powers, and then our states that cannot be accountable. And because they can't be accountable, even the work we do, even if we already know what we need to do, they can't listen to us in order to take up these, to make the right conditions for us to exist as workers in an economy that is impacted by global forces. And that's the reality of the layered struggle. And that's why we have to continue to push our governments beyond the declaration of sovereignty. And yes, the data that the US is trying to take is a matter of also sovereignty. But in another case, it can mean that your government can try to take that data in order to harm, to harm people. In another case, the government will work with the platform in order to harm workers. So we see that different constellations happen. It's not a fixed it's not a fixed thing. So, but also overall, somebody spoke about Africa, how are our governments working together or to ensure this so-called sovereignty. And when we've seen these challenges, unfortunately, we've seen repression and nationalism advances kind of inward looking. So everybody becomes your enemy, if you can, it becomes your enemy, including your neighboring states, including, so that also kind of makes African governments incapable of working together to advance something that is regional, because that requires you to have a set of variables that you agree upon. But if most of your countries are doing things as they wish, depending on the president who's in power, then we can't really come to an agreement that is going to sustain us as a people and protect us across the borders of Africa. And that's still a very big problem, because if a government tomorrow in Uganda changes and then we have a different constellation, we see governments, we see increasingly governments walking away from regional instruments of protection. So that means that even the ones that we are trying to formulate around these emerging issues of sovereignty and data, sovereignty and economic power, we will struggle, because there is not a place, there's hardly any place where governments are holding themselves accountable to a certain standard. You need that internally in order then to make a continental kind of agreement that is going to say, okay, we are all adhering to one thing, and this is in terms of public interest. So we are still having those challenges within our countries, and the talk of sovereignty seems to be only deployed when the government wants to curtail, to use its muscle against the citizens, but once in a while they might be right in terms of course, America pushing for these deals and stuff. It's also like a lens within which we can fight for ourselves, first of all, from bodily sovereignty and autonomy to all other, to also, reinterpreting it also in workers' lens. What can the sovereignty for a worker look like? Not against within the government installation and against the capitalist states that we are witnessing. Yep. Don't know if I left something out. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so the future is still in transnational, across class organizing. You talked about doctors. So, but also we have to think of like, what other ways are people able, different parts of the society can show up for a cause, So I'm wondering, if doctors can't show up on the streets, what ways can we exploit, avenues within which you can work with them so that they can support ongoing and be a building block, for whether it's a strike or a certain industrial action that is being done. So it might not arrive at the same time that we want, but we need to slowly figure out what ways would we convince, that part of the classed population to at least chip away at the power that they are serving, in order for the underserved or the disenfranchised to actually also show that if the disenfranchised nurses and student workers and interns, if this is working better, then your life will also get better. I think making those connections is instead of automatic expectation that this will happen automatically. I think we need to go in depth, whatever industrial action is going on, depending on the intricacies of that particular sector. Yeah, but definitely cross-cutting sectors, not especially when the student interns are striking. Like, it concerns us. We should see that as a very important thing, not because only they are serving us and our health is on the line. It's very important to recognize that the work they are doing is for us, but also as a people, that even if it wasn't serving us, it's important for them to be supported, for their work to be valued within the country.
Thank you so much, Rosebell. I was still, I was still eagerly listening to what you're sharing, and I think one of the key takeaways from what you have shared lastly, and what Ghislaine has also shared within the chat and through her submission, was solidarity, whether between class, between all. Oppressed classes, but also, privileged classes. So solidarity across the board is quite important, because we have seen that the forces against us are, they are besties and are in solidarity with each other. And so it is quite important for us to be in solidarity to and with each other. And as we come to a close, I will allow maybe for one or two reflections, if any. There's a lot of conversation that has happened in the chat. I think Patricia from CIPESA has also shared some of the work that they do. Please check them out and be part of FIFA Africa, that is happening, I think, in September. But if there's none, I think as we close, I want to really thank Rosebell for such a rich and grounding keynote. I think you opened up a Pandora box of a lot of things that, we may not, we had hoped for actually. And you have been able to give a wider frame for the rest of the series. And a lot of the conversation has reminded us that labor cannot be separated from questions of power, questions of democracy, violence, and all conditions that make life possible. So thank you so much, Rosebell, and thank you to everyone who joined and who listened, who has contributed. And this is the first of 4 sessions in the Feminist Labor Futures in an Age of Crisis series. Our next session will be on Tuesday at the same time. And in that session, we'll be unpacking gender, work, and the politics of survival. The registration details remain the same, and we will also be uploading these conversations on our YouTube channel at Now We Africa. And we'll also share them across all our platforms as we figure out how to run away from big tech platforms. But we'll also upload the sessions there if you'd like to engage with them more. Thank you, everyone. And maybe I'll give Ghislaine just 1 minute to share, and then we can close.
Thank you very much, my dear Joanita. I'm really glad that a feminist movement is around, and it is an appeal that we have a responsibility now to let other people to understand what is the feminism, and trade union movement need to know about feminism. Pan-Africanism, feminism, what is it? What this means? Which kind of power we have today? So I'm giving this step to us to utilize this to enter. We are 18 million workers in Africa. Let us make a propagandation of our idea of feminist approach in these classes, on this category. That is my appeal, because they are working on equality, but they didn't know more about feminism. What we are doing, like feminism, we also need to sell, we need to collaborate, we need to alliance with them to raise all of this reflection that we are doing. We are working on the expertise that we have. Please don't stay away for trade union movement. They are there. Let us give them the knowledge about feminism, what we are doing. how we can help the work today. So that is my appeal. And thank you to look at this note that I share in French, in English. We need the expertise of all of feminists who can share, because today we are talking about transformative agenda of Africa through feminist approach. Please, I need all of you to stand, to share our resources, our reflection in this category of to raise our approach, to raise our ideology, to raise our issues. Thank you very much, Joanita. And I'm expecting that I will get much expertise to collaborate and make in September this conference, successful conference where feminists will be present and give impact in what is going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ghislaine. I'm sure people have had your call to action, and we will review the concept note and ensure to support all the efforts towards building Pan-African feminist solidarity and workers' rights. And thank you everyone once again for joining us, and I hope you can join us for the rest of the sessions. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.